how to set AVS, that is voltage regulator, to the output of the inverter so that your client will not overload their inverter. How do you set that? Now we have our voltage regulator here, we have our breaker. Now if I switch on this breaker, it will supply bulb, it will supply this bulb and this iron. This is an iron here. It will supply this bulb and this iron. Now what you need to do is that what you need to do is to set the amps, the current that this AVS can supply. This AVS is a 63 amps AVS. That is, the maximum current it can supply is 63 amps. Once it's more than 63 amps, it might damage the AVS. Now, how do you set that? What you need to do is to go to number 9. Now, this is the size, that is the 63 amps. The 63 amps means that what this can supply outside at the same time at once is 63 amps, 33 amps. Now, let's say your client is using a 5 kVA inverter. A 5 kVA inverter, 48 volts, can supply at least 80 amps at full load. That is when your client use all the whole capacity of a 5 kVA inverter. 5 kVA inverter is the same thing as 4,000 watts if the power factor is 0.8. Now, 4,000 watts inverter divided by 48 volts, that's around 83 amps. Now, 83 amps means that if your client load all their appliances, connected all their appliances to a 5 kVA inverter, the maximum current the inverter will supply is 83 amps. Now, 83 amps, if you want your client now to use maybe just 50% of the inverter, the 50% of the inverter means that you don't want them to use more than, let's say, 40 amps or 45 amps. What you need to do is to set the output. You connect this AVS, you get this AVS, then you connect it to the output of your inverter. This cable that is coming here is coming from inverter. Yes, I'm using inverter to do this practical. It's coming from inverter. Now, what you need to do is to connect it to the input of your AVS. That is, the output of your inverter will goes to the input of your AVS. That is, you get external AVS. It goes to your input of your AVS. Then the output of your AVS will now goes to your breaker. From your breaker, the output of your breaker will goes to your load, or it will goes to your load or your changeover or your distribution board, as the case may be. Now, how do you set that? What you need to do is that if you don't want your client to use more than 50% of the capacity of the inverter, once you know the full current that the inverter can supply, if the inverter can supply 80 amps, what you need to do is to set this at 40. That means if your client load is more than 40 amps, this AVS will cut off the power. So, and your client will not overload their inverter. Now, what you need to do is to go to this number 9. Once it goes to this number 9, this is 63 amps, you reduce it. You press this down button here. You press it. You can press it down so that it will be fast. Press it down. Now this 40 amps, which means once the client load is up to 40 amps, immediately it is above 40 amps, this AVS will cut power. Now let's use this as a practical for this iron and this bulb. Now we have this iron and this bulb which is connected to this. Now the current that this iron always demand for is 1.5 amps. That is because it is a 300 watt. It's a 300 watt iron. You can see is 300 watts iron. Now the current, the maximum current you always use is 1.5 amps. Now what I need to do is to, if I don't want my client, I'm using this as an example. Now, if I don't want it to supply to this iron, what I need to do is that, now, if the first thing is, let's check the current of this. Once you switch it on, you can see that it has come up. Now you can see the current, which is 1.5 amps. You can see the bulb have already come up as well. 1.5 amps. Now the iron is working at 1.5 amps. Now, if I don't want this AVS, if I want to see how this AVS works, if I don't want it to supply to this iron, what I need to do is to set this AVS below this 1.5 amps, and let's see how it will work. Now, I'm going to set it. I want to set it. I will go to number 9. Remember, I've already set it to 40 before. 40. Then I'm going to reduce it to, let's say, 1 current, 1 amps. I pressed it down. Once it gets to 1 amps, I will leave it. Now it's 1. You can see that immediately it goes to 1, it cut power to this iron and the bulb. Now the timer is counting to check the timer, which is 30 seconds, is checking if the load will be reduced. Once the load is reduced, it will now come up back. If the load does not reduce, it will not supply current again. That's the timer. You can see the danger sign. It come up. Now it will cut her back. You can see as it cutting back, it's checking if the load will be reduced. If the load is not reduced, then it will not. Because I've already set the current that the maximum current you must supply is just 1 amp. But this iron demands 1.5 amps. That is the reason why it's not supplying outside. You can see it's checking again, counting down for 30 seconds, that if the load will be reduced. You see, it will come up and still cut power again. You can see it's counting now. Now let's check. Let's reduce the load. Let's switch off this iron and see if it will not supply outside. Now this is my switch for the iron. I've switched it off. Now let's see what will happen to the bulb. Let's wait. You can see the bulb have come up. Now it is stable. It has stabled. You can see it's checking. You can see the iron is not coming up because I've switched off the iron. That is the reason why it is always advisable to use this AVS for the output of the inverter. But you must first know the total current of your client load. Once you know the total current of your client load, then you can set it to it, and you know the total current your inverter, the inverter that you want to use, you know the total current it can supply. Once you know the total current it can supply, then you set it in such a way that whenever your client reach the maximum load that you want them to use, it will cut off power and they will not be able to overload the inverter. You can see now. So let me switch on the iron back. You will see that it will cut off power again. I want to switch on the iron. You can see I've switched on the iron. You can see how it cut off power. That's how it works.